You know this face, the blind old poet, brow crowned with laurel, the eyes gone milky and white. When the world says Homer, this is the face it sees. Now look closer. The edges are wet and unfinished. The paint seems to nothing at the temples. This face we are all so certain of was perhaps never quite there. Two of the greatest poems in Western literature come down to us under a single name, Homer, and that name may belong to no one at all. The Iliad, the Odyssey. Behind them perhaps a single towering genius, or perhaps only a crowd of forgotten singers, and no one man who ever lived. Between the events the poems describe and the first moment they could have been written down lies a gap of 400 years. Into that gap, scholars have poured 200 years of argument. This is the Homeric question, and it begins with who, if anyone, Homer was. The question asks how the Iliad and the Odyssey came into being, whether a single poet named Homer ever existed, and why scholars came at last to doubt him. Put simply, was there one genius who composed both epics whole, or are they the frozen record of a long tradition of bards singing in inherited formulas, handed on for centuries? The starting point is that gap in time. The Trojan War and its aftermath was supposed to have taken place in the 12th century BC. Later, Greek historians fixed the fall of Troy at a traditional date, 1184 BC, near the beginning of that century. But the alphabet came far later. Writing probably did not reach Greece before the 8th century BC. 400 years of silence lie between the war and the earliest pen that could record it. The questions follow at once. How and when and why did the epics ever come to be written down at all? And if a poet named Homer lived, why sing of events 4 centuries before his birth? How could he even know enough to try? For a long time, no one thought to ask. The Greeks of the classical age never doubted Homer, nor the war he sang. They took it all for granted. Troy had fallen, they said, most often in 1184 BC, and the one poet whom they called Homer had made both the Iliad and the Odyssey. No one asked how or from what. Yet doubt arrived surprisingly early. As far back as the 2nd century AD, some scholars began to wonder whether a Homer had ever existed. Perhaps the epics were not one poem each, but conglomerations. Shorter, separate songs, each describing a different episode, only later stitched together. These songs, they thought, had passed down by memory for generations after the Trojan War, and only then been sewn into a single clause. Certain oddities in the text fed the doubt. Some episodes within a single epic seem to contradict other episodes in the very same poem. The clearest case is in the Odyssey. In Book 11, Odysseus goes down to the underworld, speaks with the spirits of the dead, and the poem details the fate of souls. But in Book 24, it paints the afterlife quite differently. The two passages disagree about a matter of weight, hinting the poems were compilations, not one mind's work. These scattered doubts hardened into a formal debate at the very close of the 18th century. In 1795, a German scholar named Friedrich Wolff published a book, Prolegomena to Homer. Homer, Wolff argued, had been an illiterate bard, a poet who composed but never wrote, working by voice alone in the 10th century BC. His songs were carried down by memory through the poet's disciples and the descendants, and only written, Wolff believed, in the 6th century BC. Wolff's book opened the door to what became the Homeric Question, a debate that would rage among scholars through most of the 19th century. Are the Iliad and the Odyssey the unified work of one genius who conceived them whole, ordered them, and drew their characters? Everything an author does? Or are they conglomerations of shorter works, never shaped into their present form by any real author at all? As the debate spread, it settled into two camps. On one side, the Unitarians, on the other, the Analysts, also called separatists. The word Unitarian has nothing to do with religion. It means only this, that a single author can be discerned behind each epic. The Unitarians found the poems too beautifully organized to be an accident, so richly detailed, so convincingly peopled with living character. Each work they held had to be the product of one guiding intellect, one creative mind they were willing, for lack of a better name, to keep calling Homer. Some allowed one author for the Iliad and another for the Odyssey, two Homers rather than one. But this was a minor point. The essential claim was that each epic was one author's creation, whether or not the same hand had made them both. Against them stood the analysts. The poems they held could be separated into shorter original works, independent songs composed apart and later assembled, often clumsily. The debate ran the whole century with no way to settle it. To the Unitarians, epics of such grandeur could only be the work of a genius. To the analysts, collections so loose, inconsistent, and poorly joined could never be one genius. The choice came down to temperament with no evidence to decide. The deadlock held until a new kind of evidence came from an unexpected direction. The situation changed in the 1920s. In 1928, a young American Homerist named Milman Parry published research that seemed to prove the matter conclusively. The Iliad and the Odyssey, he showed, were grounded in an oral tradition, the culmination of a long practice, not the creation of a single genius. Many poets over many generations had worked within that tradition, sharing the same diction, the same stock scenes, the same storylines, and above all the same fixed expressions, formulas. At first, Parry can sound like Wolfe. Wolfe too had proposed oral composition, transmission across 4 centuries, and a writing down at the end. But the difference is fundamental. Wolfe still kept a single creative genius, an illiterate Homer who composed the poems whole, much as we have them, then memorized and handed down. Parry, by contrast, denied that anyone Homer had made them at all. In his account, the epics were created through the tradition itself, generation after generation. Many poets using the same building blocks, singing the episodes of the Trojan War and 100 other tales. What survives in the Iliad and the Odyssey is a single record performance out of a whole tradition, a snapshot of the tradition in motion. The Iliad we read is one bard telling, caught and fixed by chance. Another bard, or the same bard on a different day, would sing it differently. To see why Parry convinced so many, you have to look at the building blocks themselves. His strongest evidence was the formula. He defined it as a group of words regularly used under the same metrical conditions to express one essential idea. To grasp that, you need the meter of epic. The Homeric poems are composed in dactylic hexameter. In Greek, a remarkably supple and usable thing. It is an alternation of long and short syllables. Its basic unit, the dactyl, is one long syllable followed by 2 short ones. But the 2 shorts can be replaced by a single long, so a unit may instead be 2 long beats. The meter works poorly in English, which leans on stress, not true length. In English, it turns cumbersome and sing-song. Some have tried. Longfellow's Evangeline is among the more successful, but the effect never fully captures the Greek. In Greek, the meter is fluid, flexible, and beautiful, because the language's long and short syllables fit the hexameter line, as English never can. The final foot always closes on 2 long beats. With the meter in view, Parry's discovery comes clear. Whenever a hero or a god is named, an epithet is often attached to the name. Achilles, Hector, Paris, Menelaus. The chosen adjective is often unimportant for the moment, but crucial for the meter. Say the poet wants Hector at the end of a line and needs 3 beats before the name. He calls him Phaidimos Hector, glorious Hector. But if he needs 5 beats before the name, he calls him Korousaiolos Hector, Hector of the glancing helmet, the hero's most famous epithet. Here is Parry's essential point. Hector is not called of the glancing helmet only when his helmet matters. He is called so whenever the poet needs those 5 beats. So too with Achilles, he is Podas Ocus Achilleus, swift-footed Achilles. Even when he is sitting down, and by no means swift of foot. The meter simply calls for it in that position. The pattern grows tighter still when a hero's name changes its grammatical form. So far, these names have stood in the nominative case, the subject, the one who acts. But Greek, like many languages, is built on cases. A noun shifts its form for subject, for object, for possessor. And in each case, the hero takes a different epithet. In the genitive, the possessive, Hector is no longer of the glancing helmet. He becomes horse-taming Hector, because that is the epithet that fits the meter in that form. Parry called this behavior thrift. Different ways of naming a character do not occupy the same metrical position. For each pattern, there is usually only one way. From this economy, Parry drew a radical conclusion. In performance, the bard is not creatively choosing the best adjective for Achilles in a given moment. He is drawing on traditional set formulas. To name Achilles at the end of a line, in the nominative, you simply call him swift-footed. This runs against our modern notions of poetic inspiration, but it suits poetry composed live, where the bard builds a song from the blocks his tradition has taught him. The same principle reaches far beyond single words. It explains two further features of the epics. The first is the type scene. A type scene is like a formula spread across several lines. A scene repeated again and again in the same wording. In the Odyssey, a meal is never described afresh. A grave housekeeper comes and clears the table. She sets out baskets of bread. The diners reach for the food. And when their hunger and the thirst are satisfied, the story moves on, a fixed passage, ready whenever the bard must say, in effect, then they ate. The second feature points the very same way, the oddities of Homeric dialect. The language of the poems differs from standard Greek. It carries strange forms and many archaisms. No living Greek, so far as we know, ever actually spoke it. It is an amalgam. Very old-fashioned words, together with odd formations, words stretched to hold more syllables or squeezed to hold fewer so they fit the line. An artificial poetic language, grown for this kind of performance. A traditional idiom, not the invention of one poet composing as he goes. Parry did not rest his case on the text alone. He went looking for a living tradition to test it against. With his pupil Albert-Lord, he studied the illiterate bards of the South Slavic lands, the Guslers, men who still work inside a living oral tradition. Parry and Lord found that these Guslers used formulas and type scenes just as Homer did, building blocks for organizing their material in performance. A South Slavic bard recreated the same story in a slightly different version each time he performed it. He did not recite a memorized word-for-word text. This is perhaps the central finding of the Parry-Lord hypothesis. Ask a bard to sing a tale exactly as he sang it a year before, and he swears it is word for word the same. Yet set the two recordings side by side, and the differences run everywhere. The word-for-word accuracy Wolf imagined for his illiterate 10th century Homer does not seem to exist in a tradition built on large blocks, type scenes, formulas, and the like. The finding reaches to the very nature of the poems. If the Parry-Lord hypothesis is accepted, the first works of Western literature were not literature at all. They were performance pieces, real part created a little differently each time a bard sang them. Critics have pushed back. The songs of the Guslers are far shorter than the Homeric epics, even the longest ever recorded. They lack the same complexity. They lack, too, the internal cross-referencing found, or sought to be found, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Still, Parry, Lord, and their modern followers held firm. The epics, they were sure, were products of oral composition. Why these epics were performed, no one knows for certain. One plausible idea is that they were sung over 3 or 4 days at religious festivals, that sung poetry of the deeds of gods and heroes grew up as part of Greek worship, and that the Iliad and the Odyssey as we have them grew out of that tradition. Persuasive as all this is, it settles less than it might seem. Parry's demonstration that the epics rest on oral composition is now almost universally accepted. A few holdouts insist he and the Lord were simply wrong. But the great majority of Homerists agree. The poem somehow grew out of oral composition, and somehow is the crucial word. Exactly how oral are the epics, and how did they travel from their oral origins to the present form in which we now hold them? Here the agreement ends, and the old question opens again. Some scholars think there never was any Homer at all, that it is inappropriate even to speak of one. The epics, they say, are a single performance of traditional material, canonized because it happened at some unknown point and for some unknown reason to be written down. Others find in the poems a sophistication and complexity of design that must reflect a guiding intellect, someone we might as well call an author, though one working within the tradition. So Parry's work did not end the old quarrel between Unitarians and separatists, it only recast it. Was there a Homer who gave the material its final form, or did no such person ever exist? That the poems come to us as books at all is itself a puzzle. When, how, and why were they ever written down? Here again, there is no consensus, not even about when the alphabet reached Greece. The majority view is that the Phoenician alphabet was adapted to Greek sometime in the 8th century BC. The earliest inscriptions we know date no earlier than the middle of that century. Some argue for an earlier date, others for one much later. Nor is there agreement on how long after the alphabet's arrival the epics were recorded. Most assume a lapse of at least several decades. A new technology like writing would not at once be turned to catching orally performed poems. To us, it seems obvious. Write the great poems down before they are forgotten. But in a culture built on a living voice, writing would inspire no one at first to do so. A minority take the opposite view, that the alphabet was adapted to Greek for the very purpose of recording the Homeric epics. And the deepest uncertainty of all concerns the act of transcription itself. There is no agreement about who wrote the epics down, or how, or why. Several possibilities have been proposed. One is that the poems are oral dictated texts. Just as the Gustlers sang into Parry and the Lord's recording equipment, so at some point someone took up a roll of papyrus and a pen and wrote down what a bard recited. Many find this hard to imagine. Writing on papyrus was slow and messy. The bard would have had to recite very slowly indeed. A second possibility, that a bard trained in the oral tradition learned to write in order to record the epics himself. Most think this unlikely. Oral bards, judging by modern evidence, tend to be scornful of writing. A master of the oral art would have little motive to take it up. A third, a compromise, that a wholly illiterate Homer composed the poems, and his successors memorized them word for word, until writing was well established. Essentially Wolfe's position fitted to Parry and the Lord. In all likelihood, the exact process will never be known, barring some improbable early note in which a person records that he learned to write, in order to set down the Iliad and the Odyssey. One ancient story does claim to name the moment. It concerns the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus. Tradition holds that he commissioned a fixed text of the epics in Athens in the 6th century BC, that he gathered the bards still performing in his day and compared their versions. He had them written down and so produced the basis of the standard text. Many scholars have treated this so-called Pisistratian recension as established fact. The difficulty is the source. The earliest mention of it appears in the Latin author Cicero, writing in the 1st century BC, but Pisistratus lived in the 6th. The testimony stands some 500 years from the event it describes. Imagine relying for the invention of the printing press in the 1450s on someone in the 1950s. Someone who merely recalls that 5 centuries earlier, somebody had invented printing. Such testimony can bear very little weight. What can be said with confidence belongs to a later, better documented age. The texts of the epics were regularized through a continuous process from the 5th to the 2nd centuries BC. It happened at the Great Library of Alexandria, where some of antiquity's greatest scholars devoted their lives to Homer. They founded the tradition of textual criticism that continues to this day. And it was probably at Alexandria that each epic was divided into 24 standardized books, papyrus rolls of roughly uniform length. The very shape of the poems we read was set, not by their maker, but by their keepers. Given all this uncertainty, a word about how we speak of the poet is worthwhile. For simplicity, it is convenient to say Homer or the bard, as though such a poet existed and authored the epics, without repeating every time that he may never have lived. On balance, a position closer to the Unitarian than the analyst can be defended. The poems do show rich characterization, correspondences that run backward and forward, intricate structure, elements of design that point to a designer. Yet many Homeric scholars, probably most, disagree sharply. To hold that there really was a Homer now places one in something of a minority. We have examined the background of the poems, their composition and the development, and what these mean for how we read them. The Homeric question ends not with an answer, but with a sharper sense of what is at stake, whether the epics are the design of a mind or the residue of a tradition, whether the name Homer marks a person or only a convenient fiction. What the Parry-Lord hypothesis leaves us is not certainty, but a richer way of reading. An awareness that behind every fixed epithet and every repeated scene lies a living art of performance. The poems we hold as books were once sung, and never sung twice the same way.